I'll be reading from 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 41 through 43. As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray toward this temple, then hear from heaven, your dwelling place, do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name.
Good morning. I like how when we have a video for a women's event, a beautiful women's event, the only male in the video is Andrew. How does that happen every single time? We've been talking about what does it mean to be missional? What does it mean to have a mission mindset? As a congregation, this is something that we place an emphasis on. That we have different mission trips that we go on, but even bigger than just the individual mission trips that we go on, bless you. I'm not sure who that was, but that was worthy of a bless you from the pulpit, I can assure you. Where was I? What does it mean to have a missional mindset? Not so much just the individual missions that we have, as important as those are, but those can change from year to year. Those can change over time. Those can change as the congregation changes. But one thing that needs to remain constant is adopting a missional mindset. The mindset that each and every one of us is on a mission from God. We've said before, a couple of weeks ago, that God doesn't create the church and then give it a mission. He has a mission, so he creates the church. God's mission is to spread the knowledge of himself all throughout the world. God's mission is to make himself known all throughout the world. And as we've alluded to for the last several weeks in Bible classes and in different communion meditations, the world is a dark place. There are many parts of the world, and maybe right here in our own neighborhood, that don't know the light of God. And so our mission is to spread that light. Our mission is to be that light. And one of the working premises that we've been kind of talking about for a couple of weeks now, based out of sort of God's mission for Israel, is that Israel was not ever openly evangelistic. Like, you didn't see Israelites going outside of Israel and sort of saying, hey, come be part of us, right? Be part of the people of God. They weren't openly evangelistic in that sense. But they were indirectly evangelistic, in the sense that when the world looks at Israel, when the world sees the holiness that is Israel, when the world sees the fairness that is Israel, when the world sees the love that is Israel, the world learns something about Israel's God. The world learns that Israel's God is different from all other gods. And that's an overwhelming theme that just runs all the way through the Old Testament. We've looked at it for a couple of weeks, and we'll take a little bit different angle on it this morning, and then we'll move over the next few weeks coming up. We'll move in kind of a different direction. But I think it's important to understand that, the church is not Israel, and Israel is not the church. There is a difference in the two entities as the people of God throughout Scripture. But there's a great deal of overlap. And I would argue there's more overlap than not. There's more continuity than discontinuity. So if we can look at the mission of Israel to be the light of God in a darkened world, that's repeatedly the mission of the church throughout the New Testament, to be the light of God in a darkened world. Now, I don't know about you. We have the title here, People Who Attract Seekers to God. We made this statement before, that God seeks seekers. I don't know about you, but the people that I interact with every day, whether it's family members or neighbors or just the people that I'm around, I'm not ever around like the hardened, I hate God type of person. I'm not around, and not every atheist is like that. I don't want to characterize atheists that way. But I'm not typically around somebody who just says, I don't want anything to do with God. Right? Don't even get me started on that. I just don't know people like that. There are people out there, but I don't know them. That's not who I associate with. But I do know many people who seek God, but they haven't made that full-fledged commitment yet. I know a lot of people who are seekers of God, a lot of people who there's sort of an openness to faith, that they want to have these conversations with me. I hear it all the time, pray for me. And that comes from people who aren't necessarily religious in sort of the definitions that we would use. But if there wasn't an openness to faith, if there wasn't something there that's seeking God, they would not request of me to pray for them. In other words, you're not going to hear a hardened atheist who wants nothing to do with God come up to you and say, pray for me. I'm going through these issues. No, the hardened atheist would say, I'll take care of it myself. So it's a very kind of humanistic kind of thing. So I want to talk about the people that are around us that may be seeking God, but maybe they haven't made, that full commitment to him. There's many people that seek God but don't know him relationally. Again, there's an openness to faith. They may not have, a relationship with Jesus Christ. They may not even believe the gospel yet. They may not even believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus yet. But there's still something there. Right? Paul says in Acts 17, when he's doing his sermon in Athens, that God is not far from each one of us. That in him we live and move and have our being. And he didn't just mean Christians, because he wasn't talking to Christians when he made the statement. In other words, he said in another statement, he says, his seed is within you. And he's talking to like pagan Greek philosophers at that point. That God's seed is even in you. So everybody has this, what John Calvin would call this spark of divinity within them. God has planted his image within everybody. Now, not everybody recognizes that. But many people do, but there's a point where they can't quite get, where they need to be relationally with God. So that's where we come in. That's where our missional mindset comes in, that we understand that they're seekers of God. And then our mission is to not make that more difficult than it ought to be. Right? If there's an openness to God, don't mess that up. And that's something that we'll see that Israel kind of struggled with over time. Israel's obedience in the Old Testament served in part to draw seekers to seek God more closely. Turn to Deuteronomy 4. I know we're doing a lot of Old Testament stuff, and I do not apologize for that. So if you're waiting for that, go ahead and hold your breath. I'd rather have you pass out anyway. As Moses is about to bring the people into the promised land, he's kind of reminds them, kind of who they are, what they're doing, what God has done for them. Get to Deuteronomy chapter 4. And in our life groups tonight, we'll go back and look at the beginning of this chapter. But I want to just look at a couple of verses 5 through 8. Listen to the way that God kind of describes the seekers in their midst. See, I have taught you decrees and laws, as the Lord my God commanded me. This is Moses speaking to them, so that you may follow them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them in the way that our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws that I'm setting before you today? Did you hear it? Did you catch the motivation, at least part of the motivation that Moses gave them for obeying the decrees and the laws as they're going into the land? So that the nations those who are not Israel. The pagans, the Gentiles, different translations call them different things. It could be the nations, it could be foreigners. We'll see that in just a moment. But it's so they may look at Israel and say, this is a wise and understanding people. And they serve a wise and understanding God. It's by looking at Israel that the nations learn something about Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. You could say that Israel was seeker-friendly. And that's a loaded term. I debated whether even to get into that or not. There is a movement among churches that is a sort of a seeker-friendly movement that basically says, let's just water down everything. And let's not, I don't want to say offend anybody, but let's just make it, let's just water everything down and make truth sort of a little t. That way people aren't offended and they'll like us. And worship then becomes, sort of us pleasing them. What can we do for you? And it's kind of a friendly kind of, we promise not to ruffle any feathers and we'll just all get along. Well, number one, Jesus' ministry was not that way. Now, I don't think we should go around being cantankerous, don't get me wrong. But we do have a responsibility to the truth of the gospel. And if that offends, then so be it. Jesus did that on a daily basis. So I don't want to be that kind of seeker-friendly church, right? But I do want us to have an openness to people who are seeking God and understand that we have a role to play in whether they actually see God or not. And so the question that we're asking, what do the nations think as they observe the life of God's people? And that's the question that people are asking today. One author put it this way. I don't have this on the screen, but one author put it this way. The world will see no reason to pay attention to our claims about our invisible God if it sees no visible difference between the lives of those who make such claims and those who don't. So there has to be a difference. There has to be something that they see in us that looks different from the rest of the world. And for the seeker, when they see that we live differently than the world, for the seeker, that draws them closer to God. For the rebellious and the hard-hearted, it drives them away. But for those who have an openness to faith, for those who are open to having these God discussions, for the seekers, when they see the holiness of our lives, and when they see the love that we have for one another and the care that we take of one another, they're seekers of God, and they know what they're looking at. And it's meant to be sort of a magnet that draws them closer to God. The question is, how are we doing with that? John Stott, one of the great Reformed theologians, put it this way. The greatest hindrance to evangelism in the world today is the failure of the church to supply evidence in her own life and work of the saving power of God. Rightly, we may pray for ourselves that we may have God's blessing and mercy in the light of his countenance. Not that we may then monopolize his grace and bask in the sunshine of his favor, but that others may see in us his blessing and his beauty and be drawn to him through us. So the idea is that, ask anybody in this room, have you received the grace of God? Absolutely. So the idea is not to be hoarders of that grace, but to extend that grace so that when others look at us and they see, okay, this is a people that have understood that God has blessed them, as Matt pointed out in his prayer. As they look in and see this is a people who understands how God's grace works among them, that they are drawn to that same grace. And again, it's like a magnet that pulls them in. God seeks seekers, but he often uses us to attract them. He often uses his people as the magnet to draw them closer to him. 1 Kings 8. No sermon series would be complete without something from 1 Kings. So I'm just trying to swing for the fences here this morning, Steve. When's the last time you heard me do a sermon on 1 Kings 8? Let's get serious for a second. Never, because I've never done it. This is a first. This is a fascinating passage. There's a lot that builds up to it. This is when David was a man after God's own heart. David was Solomon's dad, who was, Saul was the first king, then you had David. David did some things very well. He was a man after God's own heart. He did some things wrong. He had an affair with Bathsheba that he tried to cover up, and it just ended up being a downward spiral of sin and cover up. But one thing David wanted to do is he wanted to build the temple for God. He wanted to do that. That was his longing as the king of Israel, to give God the temple that he deserved in Jerusalem. So he amasses all the materials, he gets all the wood and the gold and everything, and he gets it all together, and he has it all kind of in a pile, and he's ready to go to work, and God says, "You're not going to do that. You got too much blood on your hands. You've killed too many people. I've said it before, I'll say it again. David was a thug. If you crossed him, he killed you. That's the way it worked, even if you were a friend of his." God recognizes this bloodthirstiness of David and says, "Your hands are too dirty. You can't build my house, but your offspring will build it." And so Solomon, who is the son of David and Bathsheba, ironically, builds the temple. He takes the materials that David had amassed, and he builds this temple. And this is sort of a reconstruction of Solomon's temple. And if you ask the history in Judaism, there's never been a greater temple than Solomon's temple, built by the materials that David amassed in the construction project that Solomon inaugurated and built during his reign. Even Herod's is not looked on as favorably as Solomon's temple. This is the glory days of Israel. So when you get to 1 Kings 8, you have the dedication of this grand building. You have the dedication of this temple that took 7 years to build this structure. And he basically calls everyone to Jerusalem for a big, gigantic dedication and barbecue. And we won't go into the details of the food. It's more than you can count. It makes Manly Morning look like a chiclet or something. But just this huge celebration of dedicating this temple. And he kind of rehearses the history of Israel, and it's a long chapter, and we're not going to read it, don't worry. We're going to read a good chunk of it in our life group, so we won't do that this morning. But he goes into several different things, and he goes from kind of one topic to another. He has this very long prayer going all the way back to verse 23. Solomon spreads out his hands to heaven and says, and he starts praying, and just goes on and on and on. But skip down to verse 41. He kind of has this section in this prayer that I wouldn't expect. At this point, if I'm the third king of Israel, the kingdom will never get any bigger than it does with Solomon. No king will rival Solomon, not even David, in his military conquests, in his wealth. I mean, the kingdom is at its greatest under Solomon. And so you kind of get the pinnacle of national zeal as you read the prayer. It's like, it's all about Israel. And it's all about God blessing Israel. And then you have this little part in verses 41 to 43. Just in the middle of this prayer. As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people, different translations may read different things. It may say a Gentile, it may say pagan. This is anybody who's not an Israelite. Okay? As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people, Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, but because of the seeker. Right? These are not people who don't recognize Israel's God. These are people who are sympathetic to Israel's God. These are people who have seen what God has done in Israel and have taken note and have come to the conclusion that there may be something here. They've come from a distant land because of your name. Verse 42, for men will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm when he comes and prays towards this temple. So here's a foreigner, here's a non-Israelite coming to the temple of God, seeking God, and doing what? Praying. Praying to Israel's God. I know what you're thinking. Okay, well, God's not going to listen to their prayer, right? That's where I think Solomon's going to go. In verse 43, Then hear from heaven, your dwelling place, and do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people, Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. That to me is astounding. Here Solomon builds the thing, and it's got, just, if there was an Israelite flag, at that time, it'd be draped all over the place. But his prayer is that when the foreigner comes, who is not a part of your covenant people, but they seek you, and when they pray to you, what happens? You'll hear from your dwelling in heaven, and you will do whatever he asks. Talk about missional. Talk about a missional prayer. That one of the purposes behind this building is to draw people to God, to draw those seekers to God. Solomon's prayer anticipates the nations being blessed by the God of Israel, and the fame of their God spreading far and wide. Again, God seeks seekers. There's a couple of assumptions that come up in this prayer, just in the couple of verses that we just took a look at, and there's a lot more to deal with, but we won't get into it. Number one, Solomon assumes that people of other lands will hear of the reputation of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He says, when they hear of your mighty works, your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they hear of what you've done for Israel, that will draw them to you. That will be like a magnet pulling them in. So there's something about, when God blesses Israel, when God delivers Israel, it's not just for Israel's benefit, is it? It's for those who are seeking. It's for those who have an openness to the faith of Israel, that they will see and they will take note, and that will draw them in. He just kind of assumes that they will hear of this. So it kind of begs the question today, how will people hear of the works of God in our life as Christians if we're not proclaiming that in some way, shape, or form? That doesn't mean we stand on the street corner with a bullhorn yelling at everybody about what God has done for us. But wherever we find ourselves, whether it's in Honduras or Haiti or at a Good Works project on a Saturday or anywhere else, they know why we're there. They know that we're there because God has blessed us, and we want to pass on that blessing to them. That we're there because we have a recognition of what God has done for us, and that our very being there, we may not even say a word. We may not say a thing. But the fact that we're there and serving them in the name of God, that's them hearing of our God. That's how they hear of our faith in our God. So Solomon just assumes that. He doesn't say, I hope this happens at some point. He assumes it. Right? When they hear. For men will hear of your great name. So we have to be conscientious about that. Second assumption here. Solomon assumes that people from afar will be attracted, not just to hear of God's name, but will actually come and worship Israel's God for themselves and seek answers to their prayer. He assumes that's going to happen. It's not just that they hear of God and walk off. It's that they hear of God, and because they're seekers in the first place, because they've come to this place in the first place, when they hear of God, that moves them to worship God. That moves them to then pray to God. And so there's a bit of transition here from being a seeker to a follower. And all that comes about, again, remember the Deuteronomy passage that we looked at, that when the nations look at Israel, they learn something about Israel's God. When the world looks at the church, to kind of piggyback off of John Stott's quote earlier, what do they see? Do they see a people that looks just like them? Or for those who are seeking God, do they see something that they want to be a part of? That's not something necessarily that we preach with words. That can be the very lives that we live. Solomon lists some reasons earlier in the prayer. He gives some reasons of why Israelites might want to come and pray at this temple. And it's kind of a dark kind of passage. He says, anytime there's a dispute or a defeat in battle or a drought or a famine or a disease or a siege or whatever, that will prompt Israelites to come to the temple and to pray to God. There's something about, the trials of life, the sufferings that we go through. We've talked about this on Wednesday night, that kind of, bring us to our knees. Well, that's the best position in which to pray, right? When life knocks you down, that's when you pray. Well, you should pray always, but specifically when life knocks you down. So what Solomon's kind of getting at is, look, these things are going to happen. There's going to be droughts, there's going to be famines, there's going to be sieges. We're not going to win every battle. And when you're kind of down like that, the best place for you to go is to be in the sanctuary. To go to be in the presence of God, to be in the presence of your protector, your provider, holy God, Yahweh. So he kind of throws that out there. And then that's when he follows it up with, as for the foreigner, or the seeker who then comes to pray. And what I would have expected him to say would be something like, when the Gentile comes to pray to the temple, that you would drive him away, and that you would keep him far away, and that you wouldn't answer his prayer. And you get just sort of this rah, 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 go Israel, go, this sort of, extreme Zionism kind of thing. But instead, Solomon says that when they do come and pray, that you'll hear them and that you'll heal them. Just as life has knocked back the people of Israel, it will do that to the Gentiles as well. Life knocks you back. And what Solomon says is use that as an opportunity to come to the temple and to pray. And that's not just for the people of God. That's for the foreigner as well. And it's even more than that. It's even more than that. Let me give you one more quote, and then I want to get on to the next slide very quickly. Christopher Wright points out in his book, The Mission of God's People, God attracts worship and prayer, even from those who do not know him in all his biblical revelation. God hears and answers the prayers of those who do not yet belong to his covenant people. This is what's kind of amazing to me. When you kind of really look at the content, you kind of really dig into this prayer. In no time in the Old Testament era did God ever promise to do for Israel whatever they might ask of him. He says something about the nations, about the foreigners, about those who are outside of the covenant community, that he doesn't even say about those who are in the covenant. At no point does the Old Testament ever say, God's going to answer your prayers. Now, according to his will, he does. I know all that. Okay, I got that part. But at no point does God ever say, I'll just give you whatever you want. But that's exactly what Solomon says about the foreigner, isn't it? That when he prays, you will answer him. And you will do for him what he asks. It's a little troubling to me because even when you get to Jesus, this is a promise that Jesus made to his disciples in John 15, that, that I will do whatever you ask in my name. When Jesus says that, it's kind of like, okay, well, that's sort of expected, right? We're his children and we're in relationship with him. And, again, it's always according to his will, so it's not whatever we ask, right? I could ask for a Ferrari, and I might even get it. But most likely not, because God knows that's not good for me, right? I told you about our back in Florida, we had a part-time youth intern that needed a car, and the car that he isolated out of the little catalog, what's it called, the Auto Trader, was a Porsche, and that's the one that he wanted. And the church had said, we will help you buy a car, so he narrows it down to a Porsche. He had to keep looking. I don't think he ever actually even got one, as a matter of fact. I think I drove him around all summer. But Jesus promised his disciples that he will grant their requests because there's a relationship there with them. He's close to them. This is when Jesus is on his way to the cross. This is his farewell discourse where he's trying to encourage them. And you kind of expect that God will answer the prayers of his people. But that's not what Solomon says. Solomon says there's going to be a lot of things that you don't get that you're going to pray for. But what Jesus says to his disciples, Solomon says about the foreigners. That God will answer their prayer because they're seeking him. Solomon asked God to do for foreigners what God has not even promised to do for Israel. And it's kind of open-ended. It makes me a little uncomfortable. Because what are they going to pray for? You know, what is God going to grant them? And it's open-ended, and it just kind of leaves it that way. You know, let God be God. And let God decide how he's going to answer the prayer. But rest assured that God hears the prayers of outsiders. Just like he hears the prayers of his people. Right here on Sunday morning, we're praying and all that, and, you know, we're doing fine. God hears the prayers of seekers who may not have a covenant relationship with him yet. And finally, the motivation. Why would God do such a thing? Why would God answer the prayers of those who are outside of his covenant people? Why would God be so eager to answer the prayers of these foreigners who have come to his temple? Solomon states it pretty plainly, because of your own reputation. That when you answer their prayer, guess what they're going to do with that? They're going to take that elsewhere. They're going to take that back to their territories. They're going to take that back to their lands. And God's reputation is magnified when he answers the prayers of these people who don't know him. God's reputation is built up when he answers the prayers of foreigners, the way that Solomon says it. All the peoples on earth may know your name. What's our motivation? It has to be about God. We don't go to Honduras because we feel sorry for them. We don't go to Haiti because we feel sorry for them. We don't help out in Coatesville building homes because we feel sorry for people. That's not godly motivation. According to Solomon, the motivation should be to declare your name. Not your name, his name. So that they may know something about our God. This is a missional prayer when you read it in its whole context. This is a plea for the nations to come and worship Israel's God. Now, Israel struggled with this. If you continue reading, it'd be nice if it ended here, but we know the rest of our Old Testament. They struggled with this idea, and they did everything they could to keep foreigners away from the temple. And they went to great lengths, and they slaughtered a lot of nations. And so they struggled with this idea of allowing foreigners access to the temple. Herod, even in his temple, had a court of the Gentiles where they could actually come and pray, but then there was a sign in the middle of it that said, if you go past this point, the penalty is death. Okay, so we'll let you come pray, just don't get too close to the altar, or we'll have to take you out. Right? Well, is that really missional? Is that really the open heart of God? Is that really being the people of God? The books of Ruth and Jonah, both of them, are about outsiders who find the God of Israel. And that may be a reason that both of those books were written in the first place, to remind Israel who they were to be as a people and what their mission was. In short, I think we have to pray like Solomon. The greatest motivation for our missions has to be to spread the name of Christ. And what Solomon said of the temple, that this will spread your great name, that has to be our motivation. If it's anything less than that, it doesn't count. If it's anything less than that, then it doesn't exalt God the way that he deserves to be exalted. So when we go to Honduras and when we go to Haiti and when we go to do good works and we go to our schools, into our neighborhoods, into our workplaces, and when we interact with seekers, it has to be about the name of Christ and nothing else. It's not about me. It's not about my efforts. It's not even about what God has done in my life, however great that may be. That's all indirect. It's about magnifying the name of Christ so that seekers are drawn closer to him. Our attitudes must match our motivation because the world is watching. We can't go and say we're the people of God and act like people of the world. The world is too smart for that. And seekers are way too smart for that. Seekers will see the disconnect faster than we can. If we're going to say that we bear the name of Christ, our behavior has to match that. If you think about it, this message of outsiders, everyone in this room starts out as an outsider. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that we were darkened in our understanding, that we were aliens from the people of God, that we were foreigners from the people of God, and that we were even enemies of the cross. We all start as outsiders. So the message that we're taking as we go and do our missions, as we go and adopt this missional mindset, is that we communicate that to people, that we too were outsiders. And we need to look for ways in which we can do for others what God has done for us. That's mission. Doing for others what God has done for us. Even to foreigners. Even to those who don't have a relationship with God. Especially for those who don't have a relationship with God. The lesson is yours. We'll stand and sing.